On behalf of Denise Crane Scott and her children and grandchildren, and on behalf of the entire Scott family, I want to thank you for coming to this worship service and Dad's funeral today. You should know that Dad has been working on this service for about 15 years, which is why Denise was not in that video, because it was done before she came into the picture. And Dad has assigned all of us parts for this service. He even wrote some of our speeches. I guess it was his way of ensuring that we wouldn't mess it up. However, since he's not here, we boys have decided to ad-lib just a little bit. If we did everything he outlined, we would be here until Jesus returned. We think, though, in one way or another, we have honored his wishes and at the very least incorporated all of his requests in this service. For instance, he had us singing the hymnal, the entire hymnal. Okay. And those songs that he requested are in the service somewhere. Maybe you heard some of them in the Prelude, and you'll hear other of them referred to, at least even verbally, and we will sing some of them. But Dad wanted to greet you personally today, and I recorded that greeting at the Preaching Center of Ozark Christian College some years ago. I told you he'd been working on this for a while. And that welcome of Dad's does exist in cyberspace somewhere. I have no idea where it went from my computer. But I did save a hard copy, and I would like to read it to you for the welcome. So this is Dad. Just pretend. Thank you, dear friends, for coming to my funeral service. I have prepared it for you. If when you leave this service you think Bob Scott was a great guy, I have failed miserably. But when you leave, I hope there will be on your heart the name of a friend, neighbor, co-worker, and you will be thinking, I just must find a way to tell him or her about my best friend Jesus. Or if some song or scripture causes you to resolve to live the kind of life that will be more pleasing to God, I hope you will think your time today was well spent. When you leave this service, there are two words I want to be singing in your heart. One is lavish. Praise God for the way he has lavished his love upon us, like a full ladle of gravy poured over a biscuit. Food mattered to this man, if I might just take a moment. I don't know too many funeral welcomes where you talked about biscuits and gravy, but anyway, that was the image that came to his mind. The other word is resolve. Comes from one of his favorite songs, I am resolved, no longer to linger. And he says, I hope you will be making a new resolution to live the Revelation 2:10 kind of faith. In case you don't know, that's the passage that says, be faithful unto death. That daily will give the devil a nervous fit, and that you can, with God's grace, say with me in the Apostle Paul, I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith, and now there is in store for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall award to me on that day, and not only to me, but to all those who have longed for his appearing. And then Dad just said, amen. God bless you. That's it. One word before I pray. When the service concludes, following Phil's benediction, the funeral personnel will come and prepare the casket, at which time Denise and we 5 boys will stand in front of the casket while they take care of it. And then the casket will be taken down the center aisle, and the family will follow. The casket will be taken to the funeral car by the grandson pallbearers, and we will all pretty much head to Ozark Memorial Cemetery. So we'll have time for a little greeting in the foyer, but not too much. because we must make our way there by a certain time limit. If you plan on going in the funeral procession to the cemetery, there are several intersections. Be sure to get your lights on and follow if you so choose. Well, let us pray. Lord, I want to thank you for a little crippled boy. I want to thank you for a grandma who pumped his legs day after day after day from polio so he could walk. I want to thank you for his life. I want to thank you for the heritage of family that has evolved. I thank you for Denise and the Crane family that have come into our lives more recently. We know there's no place you're not because you're omnipresent. But visit us with a special sense of your lavish grace and lift us from this place with resolve. Even though charmed by the world's delight, things that are higher, things that are nobler, may we leave with these things having allured our sight. We pray in the strong name of Jesus. Amen.
Dad loved the word of the Lord, loved to preach it, loved to teach it, and he loved announcements, so we're done with those, okay? But he loved the old hymns. And as Mark mentioned, when we first started on this service several years ago, he talked to me about leading the music today. I think we had 10, and I got them down to 8. Today we're going to do about 3 of those, but other ones will be inserted as we mentioned here. Here's why he loved the old hymns, though. He loved the old hymns because he told me many of times, well, the hymns tell the story. They tell the story. That's why you need to sing all of them. Now, I was a young guy leading music at our church, and I approached him one time, and I said, well, Dad, I have noticed that sometimes the 3rd and 4th verses are left out. Why? I stumped him. He didn't know why we did it that way sometimes. Of course, I knew to shorten the service just a little bit, but he didn't know why. And then he didn't really respond, so I said, well, I think I know. He said, what's that? I said, because the last verse is kind of the end of the story. And that's because the best was to come at the last verse. And he said, well, it sounds good to me. So Monday, Dad came to the last verse. The best was yet to come. And I just kind of wonder if this is what he thought. Oh, that will be glory for me, glory for me, glory for me. When at his grace I shall look on his face, that will be glory for me. Will you stand and sing this song with me? When all life's labors and trials are o'er, and I am safe on that beautiful shore, just to be near me, dear Lord, I adore. When through the ages be glory for me. Oh, that will be glory for me, glory for me, glory for me. When by his grace I shall look on his face, that will be glory because he lives, I can face tomorrow. Because he lives, all fear is gone. Because I know he holds a future, and life is worth a living just because he lives. God sent his son. They called him Jesus. He came to love, heal, and forgive. But you and I, to God I'm pardon. An empty grave is there to prove my Savior lives. And then one day, what will happen? Across a river, I'll fight my fight. No more with pain. That's exactly right. And then as death, what does it do? Gives way to victory. I'll see the light of glory, and I know he lives. Because he lives, I can face tomorrow. Because he lives, all fear is gone. Because I know he holds the future, and life is worth the living just because he lives.
Everybody says, Amen. Please be seated. I'm Tim, not Tom's clone, as the bulletin might indicate. At a memorial service, you can expect to learn information about the loved one. You'll hear the reflections from those sharing, and you might even walk away with some inspiration as you live out your days and prepare to meet your Maker. Well, since the obituary was assigned to me, it's going to be mostly informative, but I didn't want to completely miss out on those other two. Robert A. Scott, Bob, was born March 29, 1927, Omaha, Nebraska, to Ray and Myrtle Scott. And he was stricken with polio at that young age, but he wanted to let you know they were not poor because they could afford a daytime nurse to take care of him. But that changed with that Great Depression. That caused his father to have to begin doing mechanic work, which happened to be our dad's lifelong hobby, which he did for the next 80 years. You'd find him working in the shop. And I think that was probably the bulk of his time outside of second only to ministry hours. Well, he also said, that his dad had served in World War I, and Dad was in ROTC, and during college, that's when World War II was on. So Dad said that the war and depression profoundly affected him. Now, he was that third of four children because his brother Cleo was at a very young age when he died. So Bob Scott grew up with two sisters, Doris and Jean. But the significant life event was Dad's baptism into Christ in 1941. And after his baptism, after that and his graduation from high school, he followed that preacher down to go to Restoration Bible College in San Antonio, Texas. Well, that preacher had his father-in-law, father-in-law was there, and then his sister-in-law was there, who happened to be Cecil Grace. So Bob and Cecil then, they married and began their life June 27, 1946. And he liked to joke, that made his preacher his brother-in-law, his roommate his father-in-law, and his live-in his wife. So they said they lived together from the day they met. And we're always amazed because we think 74 years together. And till she passed early last year, and then he married Denise on September 28, 2021. So the entourage of the survivors include, obviously, Denise and Dan, Mark, Phil, Tom, and myself, and then the stepchildren among the Cranes, Scott, William, and Laura, with the two families producing 24 grandchildren, 48 great-grandchildren, and one great-great-grandchild on the way, give or take a few, we're not sure. So there's a legacy, and as a kid, I can remember being at the supper table, and Dad would sometimes say that he was so rich, and I thought, what are you talking about? You could tell by the cars we drove and the clothes we wore. It's like we are not on the upper rungs of society's ladder. But you know that a man's wealth is not totaled up in dollars and possessions. I knew even before I came to Christ that I had a privilege of growing up in this family of God. Now, a rich legacy is a man who leaves behind generations of Christians. A man's true wealth is displayed through his loved ones. Well, then we consider the man's deeds. And after his short ministry there in Texas, Dad considered a miracle that he and Mom traveled north, where eventually he got enrolled at Ozark Bible College, and he held that close connection with the school for like 75 years plus. Then he later earned that MA from seminary in Lincoln, Illinois, and then, of course, along with all the service to different Bible colleges, I can't think of the numbers of people that young people that Dad influenced to go to Bible college. And quite a few of them were coincidentally at the same time that he was serving as camp manager at that Northeast Iowa Christian Service Camp, all part of that legacy of deeds. And, you know, the awards that are back there, and, you know, Dad was served on alumni associations and convention committees. And long before secretaries would stand over copiers and do church bulletins, Dad did that himself with his offset press. But you know his big focus, those churches. 10 of them that he served full time. The 2 in Kansas, Humboldt and Council Grove, 1 in Indiana, Francisville, the 1 in Missouri, Lamar, and then the rest were all Iowa. Webster City was 2 separate occasions. Council Bluffs, that was a new church plant. Mondamon, Melcher area, and then the longest time as preacher at the Waterloo, Iowa church, also fairly new, and then most of us boys were educated there. Even in retirement, he held many of those interim ministries, including Park Plaza. So you look over that, you say, well, it's clear. Bob Scott's life focus was the Church of Christ. And he gave attention to CEM, that's the Christian Evangelistic Mission that he helped charter. What's their purpose? Starting new churches. So to Preacher Bob, God's restored church was the answer to all the world's problems. He believed and often said that when your feet hit the floor in the morning, give the devil fits. So a man's purpose is expressed through his deeds. But then there's the man's heart. Speaking of fits being thrown, Scripture asks, who really knows the man except the Spirit within? You know, you can be close, proximity to someone, but that doesn't mean that you pick up on everything about him, like deep thoughts within. So I had the most concentrated time with my dad, and really the longest consecutive period of days outside of childhood, just a couple years ago. I was taking care of him while Mom was up in skilled nursing. And I saw a side of my father I'd never seen before. 3 words came from his lips. I did this. Now, not unusual considering all that he accomplished in his life, but actually that was said with a very different tone in something related to mother. And I'll be forever grateful for seeing a very tender moment in his life that provided insight into his heart. It was remarkably confessional. A man's heart is revealed through confession. And that's something we should do and get better at, because no matter how much we do now, we are going to be doing it later. when we all have to stand before the Savior to give an account for everything we did while in the body and for repayment, good or bad. And every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. So may this man, this father, inspire and encourage us all.
I asked my dad more than once through the years so that I could get this story correct. What caused him to become a Christian? I knew that my grandfather was not very interested in Bible studies or church meetings during my dad's younger years. What Dad told me was that when he was a teenager, they took a family vacation, which was rare, from Omaha to the northwest coast of the United States. It was during that trip through the Rocky Mountains that he began to think about what would happen to him if their car went over the edge of the road and fell to the bottom of the canyon below. He would die. So at age 14, after that trip, he proclaimed Jesus as Lord of his life and was baptized. After high school graduation, with the encouragement of the minister and former minister and members of the Benson Church of Christ, he decided to go to Bible college and prepare for the work of church ministry. He said he chose his life's work as an expression of thankfulness for Christ who loved him. Everything he did had a direct line to the institutional church. Whether it was preaching, teaching, dinners, singing, conventions, meetings, calling on visitors or the sick, helping widows or others in need, youth camps, vacations, missionaries and their missions, new church plants, Bible colleges, counseling, writing bulletins, and the list goes on. I'm sure that many of you could add to this list. In our house, church attendance was not optional. Being prepared was not, unprepared was not an excuse. Your shoes were shined, your tie was straight. You must leave the house 30 minutes or an hour before services as not to be late. Even though the church building sometimes was close to or next to the parsonage we lived in. Some things our parents do deny logic. But Dad always wanted to be prepared. As long as I can remember, Dad always demonstrated a paramount, uncompromised zeal for serving the Church of Christ. He was willing to sacrifice his time, energy, resources, self-pleasure, sleep, entertainment, and time with his family. Some may say that was too much to give. But I saw a life full of joy and blessing that only God could give. Many of the churches he served were small, poor, old, young, struggling, disunited. But that never discouraged him nor mother from moving to serve the Lord's church. There were many times that he had broken heart over things that had happened in the family of Christ. It would have been easy for him to give up, just walk away, and call it quits. Except he refused to give the devil a victory. And he refused to abandon his commitment or faith toward his Lord. In a message given to the men of this church a few years ago, he said, I was and am convinced that the Lord's church is the only real answer to the world's problems. Though through God's grace, let me be in his glorious kingdom. He told me he was full of thankfulness and gratitude for the love that Christ lavished upon each of us. He expressed that gratitude by serving others. Consider these two questions. Dad would sometimes ask at the end of the close of a church service, what would happen if you died today? Are you prepared for Jesus' return? The other question Jesus asked, do you love me? We have witnessed Dad's test paper with the final answers. Yes, age 14. Yes, 81 years.
I count it a privilege that I got to know Bob in the last years of his life. In fact, I knew his wife, Cecil, better than I knew him. Cecil sat next to me in our weekly Bible studies, and I enjoyed her beautiful alto voice in the choir. It was after her funeral that Bob came to see me to be his housekeeper. Even though he was 93 and still driving the car, I was surprised how difficult it was for him just to live every day. The week before we planned to get married, he fell and broke his hip. Then he could not even get out of bed without help. When you saw him on Sunday, you saw a happy, smiling Christian, and you wouldn't know that he would not think of coming to church with a single hair out of place, or his tie not perfectly tied, or his shoes not shined. And you should know that when any of you commented on how nice he looked, he was a little embarrassed because he didn't dress to influence you. His dress was a little akin to the Old Testament, when a believer seeking forgiveness of sins took an animal to be sacrificed. The animal was to be perfect, not having a single blemish. Bob felt that even at his best, he was hardly worthy of the attention of our awesome God. His dress was a sign of his respect for God. Ladies, what are you wearing to church when you go? Is it respectful of God? What you didn't know, it took real effort and 2 hands to comb his hair, or that it took both hands and his hair not more than 10 inches from a light switch in order to turn it on. Due to growing up during the Great Depression, he never threw anything away. He has trouser belts that are 40 years old and would not look scroungy if he didn't polish them before he wore them. Did you ever know anyone that polished their belts? God did. It took a part of having everything perfect for Sundays. It was part of having everything perfect for God. The Lord's Supper was the main thing on Sunday. Seldom did he get through communion without being in tears. In over 42 years he preached in Iowa. Very few folks knew that he wrote the plans for starting new churches, a mission called Christian Evangelistic Mission, CEM. At the anniversary of the mission, he asked the leaders of the mission how many people attend churches that were started by the mission. The answer? over 5,000. Stars in his crown. There's one more thing I thought of, and this is Bob speaking, really. There's one more thing I thought you would like to know. Most of you probably know that Bob had polio when he was 2 years old, and that left him crippled in his feet and legs. In the 9th chapter of 2 Samuel, there is a story of Mephibosheth. I practiced that one. who was injured in infancy and crippled in both feet. King David wanted to show kindness. He asked Mephibosheth to henceforth eat at the king's table. Some time ago, Charlie King used this story to illustrate how we as Christians are invited at communion time to eat at the king's table. In this case, Jesus' table. Bob said to me, "That's me." I always saw myself as the poor little crippled boy that God let work in his kingdom and eat at his table. Isn't that sweet? Now you can see why he was often in tears at communion time. He was that little Mephibosheth. Bob felt that it was a profound privilege just to be a Christian. Well, you saw Bob as a little white-haired Christian that barely weighed 120 pounds. But I saw him as a spiritual giant.
We're going to take just a few minutes maybe, for a few memories and testimonies, maybe from some of you. We want to do this expeditiously, so if you have a memory or a testimony, you can make your way up here right now and sit over here on my right on these seats. That would be a good thing, so you'd be prepared and ready to go. But while you might be coming or thinking about what to say, I want to say just a couple things if I could myself. First of all, Denise, we all want to thank you. You have, as we mentioned at the house the other night, brought our dad joy, and you have taken care of him in his most feeble years and months. And on behalf of the boys, thank you for doing that. We're very, very grateful. And you need to know, if you haven't picked it up already, that Dad loved the church. You can see that from the video. Most people, you know, when they're showing family pictures like you saw in the video, it's about the vacation at the beach. What you saw were cars and church buildings, because that's kind of what it was, see? So Dad loved the Restoration Movement, the American Restoration Movement, the Stone Campbell Movement. He just thought that was the greatest thing since sliced bread. It made such sense to him that if we could just do that and get a hold of that plea, that we could unify the believers out there. Obviously, as already mentioned, he loved cars, specifically Volkswagens. We all learned to drive on them, wreck them. He would fix them, and that's how it worked. Dad loved Ozark Christian College. He just was so proud to be an alumnus of that school, and he loved to go and go and go. And it probably was fitting that he passed away in his home state of Nebraska while he and Denise were on a trip, because COVID just about killed him when he and Mom were locked up. That's how he talked about it at Spring River Christian Village. They got us in lockup, you know. So anyway, he couldn't go. He wanted to be able to go. And so that was a great privilege for Denise to be able to drive him so he could go. But most of all, Dad loved the Lord, and he led each of us boys to Christ. And you know, people, you can do a lot of wrong things in life. But if, like Noah, you can save your household, that's a pretty good thing. That's a pretty good thing. One person unable to be here today sent a little story that we will read for you. This is Crystal Cruz. Some of you might remember Julio and Crystal Cruz. They live in Florida, and this is Phil and June's oldest child. And just so happens that she was the first girl in 53 years in our family. We were pretty much stacked with boys, but Crystal was the first girl. And she wrote this and asked if it could be inserted at this point in the service, and I'm glad to insert it. Over the past few days, I've enjoyed reflecting on my memories with Grandpa. Some of them were thrills, like when he would take us on carnival rides and squeal like a kid himself. Have any of you experienced that? Some of the people in Lamar Fair would have experienced that years ago. Yeah. Anyway, others are nuggets of wisdom he shared with me at critical times. I will always remember the smell of his aftershave and how his whiskers would rub against my cheek when he hugged me. I will never forget the day he baptized me in 1991. I could go on and on about the memories that have come to mind, but I'm told this service is already going too long, so I won't do that. However, I do want to share a memory of him that impacted me most, and the one that I tell my kids even now. I was about 15 years old, and Grandpa and Grandma had come to visit our family during a difficult time in Charlotte, North Carolina. While we were there, he needed his electric shaver repaired. So he got out the yellow pages. And she has in parentheses, kids, you'll have to ask your parents what that is. And he did his typical research work. Soon he had located a place that could help him. He showed me an address and asked if I knew where it was. As a 15-year-old girl, I can assure you, as I did him, that I did not. But I had recently discovered MapQuest. I'm not sure if that's still a thing, but you kids can find out about it, like 90s version of Google Maps. So I jumped on the internet, plugged in the address, printed out a map for him to follow. He seemed impressed, and I was so proud of myself, he decided he should probably take this genius grandchild along, and feeling very proud now, I agreed. We got in the car and took off, him driving me the passenger seat with my printed map in my lap. We talked as we rode, and I told him about the sites we were passing. We finally came to the road we were looking for, and he asked me whether he was supposed to turn right or left. Right, I said. So he turned right, and we continued on. We traveled a mile or two down the road and began looking for the shop, but could not figure out where it was. Figuring we had missed it, he turned around. We came back at it from the other direction, but still no luck. This continued for 15 or 20 minutes. I could feel my genius level plummeting, so I began scouring my map to see what had gone wrong. And that's when I saw it. I'd been holding the map upside down. Oh man, I knew I had to tell him, but I was cringing as I confessed what had happened and how that right was supposed to be a left. I was just sure he was going to be incredibly mad at me. Here we had wasted time and fuel, and we were completely on the wrong end of the road we needed to be on. I was unbelievably tense as I waited for him to respond, and then I heard him chuckle, and he smiled and gave me his characteristic, "Oh, Shaw." Then he made a comment about how we all make mistakes, and he turned the car around the right direction. I remember feeling so relieved and thankful. We finally made it to the shop, and on the way home, he told me stories about mistakes he had made. Then we laughed about it at the supper table that evening. Years later, I recounted this story to Grandpa. He didn't remember it at all, but I did. That day, he had shown me in real life what grace looks like. I'm so thankful for all the lessons he taught me, even the ones I didn't know he was teaching. For the example of resilience and trust in God that lived out for me to see, for countless meals and devotions around his dining room table, for loving my husband and my kids as his own, and for being a wonderful grandfather. That's Crystal. Okay. Casey, let's have you come each to these mics, please.
Just do hunch. Okay. My name's Casey. I'm the eldest grandchild. Some of my cousins are here. You guys probably knew Grandpa better than I did, because by the time they got to Joplin, I had left. But the thing I think that if I could inherit anything from my grandfather, it would be his tenacity. Some of my uncles have talked about, adjacent to this, just did not give up. Polio survivor, COVID, broke stuff in his body. He just did 70 years in ministry. So I guess all I have to say is, if I could inherit half of his tenacity, it would be twice as much as I need.
Lita, you might state your name.
I'm Lita Wilson. I grew up hearing the name of Bod Scott, my parents speaking of him. I'm the daughter of Seth and Anna Wilson. And I saw him at any of the meetings at OBC. He would always come. He would always have a smile and a cheerful greeting for people. One of his grandsons, whose name I don't even remember right now, sold me a car once. And I had some trouble with it. And I talked to Bob, and he said, I'll fix it for you. I discovered all I had to do is bring the car to his garage, and he would scoot around, take things apart, put things together, charge me no money. I was impressed. My own father loved to work on cars. We called it Daddy's playing cars. He loved to have people who would play cars with him. One of my brothers-in-law, they got along great because when my youngest sister would come and bring her husband, he'd play cars with Daddy. He liked to take them apart and put them back together. He was very disgusted when you had to have a dealership do that. So I was impressed that Bob could do the same thing and that he would do it for me for free. I knew something more about this preacher.
Thank you, Lita. Debbie, come right ahead. This is Debbie Kramer, and Dad's been involved with she and Jerry in the. Okay, I'll hold it.
Thank you.
Sure, that's all right.
Preacher Bob called me his friend, and I consider it an honor. I first learned of Preacher Bob from Casey Scott, his grandpa, and he could tell he was really proud of that grandpa. At Ozark, I learned that he was Mark Scott's daddy. And at Ozark, he come to meet me, and he said, oh, what an oasis Ozark is, Debbie Kramer. Later on, God birthed a ministry through me called Gifts for the Nations. And God laid upon my heart, being a farm girl and 3 girls of a daddy, he had no boys. We learned to work on tractors. I learned of the work overseas through Brother DeWelt, the need for missionaries to just have basic things. Well, Preacher Bob was determined to help my husband, who was not going so well at fixing a tractor. He came over to Mound Valley. And Jerry loved to fish. We learned that Preacher Bob loved to eat fish. So we would fry crappie and fried taters with onions, and I would always make a scratch cake. Around the table, we learned to love each other. The stories came, sometimes of you boys who he adored. He was proud of you and what you yourselves had done for the Lord, for the Church of Christ. He touched my heart. A few months back, he and his new wife came. He said, friend, I'm headed to in the area and I want to stop by. And I said, well, I hope you're coming for dinner. Jerry caught fresh fish. Jerry, because I talk so much, cooked the whole meal. Preacher Bob said, I'm going home soon. We talked about his passing. He said, Debbie? No, he never called me Debbie. Friend, I want to go to sleep someday and just wake up in the arms of Jesus. I received a call Monday. Preacher Bob just went to sleep, and he's now in the arms of Jesus. By the way, our first tractor into West Africa has his hands works on it. It's up working in the northern region of Ghana. It serves to help the Church of Christ, to feed orphans and widows. I'm going to miss my friend, but with the hope of Jesus Christ. I'll see him again.
Thank you, Debbie.
Sorry for crying.
We'll let you cry today. That's all right. All right. Come on, Michael.
Michael Scott, I'm the oldest son of the oldest son. Usually I'm sitting back there, so this is going to be tough. But it was different growing up because we lived in Arkansas and we didn't travel back and forth a whole lot. So what we knew of Grandpa, really kind of my second brother, was just kind of going back and forth, loading up in a 73 Oldsmobile with a rack on the top of it to bring back Iowa corn. that we usually pulled out of containers that were sitting on the front porch when we got there. There were a few trips when I was younger that I can recall where it was just my dad and I. We'd driven up. We were driving up. I was going to the VBS that year, and we were up there for the whole week. And I can remember driving up, and we were proud because we got 32 miles a gallon in that car, and it was a beast. Still has it, I think. But we, while we were up there, I won't get too long-winded here. One of the things that always was unique about Grandpa and just the interaction he had with Grandma was that we were there, and he said, "Well, we need to go up and mow the yard at the church." And I'm pretty sure I was around 10. And he said, "Why don't you just take the mower and I'll follow you in the car?" And I thought, I don't know about that. It was a couple miles away, and I'm pretty sure I never got to drive on streets, so I always stayed kind of in the yard. Later did I find out that I would be driving tractors with my dad over 30 miles to the lake and back to mow out there. Yeah, it was. But I got there, and I don't know, there was some little thing, I think I threw a belt. He came out there, and we kind of worked through it. But in fact, it was at that Indianola church. But the whole time he said, "There's no reason you can't do it." And being a little kid, of course I can do it, because Grandpa told me I could. So that's the way it was. And but then coming back, I think Grandma picked me up and said he didn't need to do that anymore. So, as luck would have it, I was saved by Grandma. But it was always so wonderful that when they moved down to Joplin, that there's a picture. There was a picture that we took of the 5 generations of the firstborns. And it really meant a lot to me. At the time, I didn't realize. I just thought, wow, we should have got a haircut. And that was not the right shirt to wear. But it was really good to have that memory and to realize that through the years how important it was for us to look back and take the time to honor everything that was going on around us. And I think a lot of times through the years, he took that time, and I'm glad he did, because it really made a big difference to everyone that he affected.
Memories matter. Maybe that's why the Lord said to do this in remembrance of me. Fred?
I'll be brief. Sitting amongst the herd of Scots, I'm not even going to attempt to say anything super spiritual to you. But, and I wasn't going to say anything at all until Casey mentioned that word, tenacious. Where I come from, we call that strong-willed. Now, raise your hand if you agree. I said I'd be brief. I entered the ministry later in life, and my body's tried to prove that over about the last 10 years. And I had a quadruple bypass, and at that time, I thought, that's enough. I've taken care of my ministry responsibilities. The Lord's pleased with me. That's it. And Bob didn't let that go to roost. No, he encouraged me to continue. They ministered, he and Cecil ministered to me clear through that. Back to the tenacity, strong wills. I ministered in a church with 3 steps. It's almost identical to this. Bob filled in for me a number of times when I couldn't be there. And with his handicap, he wouldn't call it that, he had trouble with those steps, and I knew that. So before I left I had the folks from the church put the pulpit and the microphone and everything on the floor for Bob. And I heard about this later. He was walking up, and one of our elders gave him a hand, which I think offended him just a little, and pointed him to it. And he said, and this is, the elder quoted it to me, "Is that where Fred preaches?" I said, no. He said, "Fred preaches up there." Yeah. Well, that must be the way it's supposed to be done. And he struggled up those steps and preached up there. And I'll close by saying, I thank God that no one ever told him that that microphone on the floor was my idea.
All right. This is Nellie Chambers, neighbor.
Longtime neighbors. Bob and Cecil were some of our first contacts when we moved to Joplin and became some of our best friends. And after the pandemic, I ran a lot of errands for Bob, and he sent me a card that I've kept. He said, "I think that at certain times in our life, God puts certain people in our life." And I think that's true. I think at the right time, Bob and Cecil came into our life. And I hope that my Bob and I can be the blessing to other people that they were to us.
Thank you all, and I'm sure there's more memories through the day to share, but we're going to sing just a little bit, and then Phil's going to preach a really short sermon.
Preparation was everything. And seeing that one picture up there, that ordination, I know that guy. And one of the things about preparation with Dad was, and I know Phil would know this well, but one of the things that would happen is when the preacher boys, because there were several from Waterloo and ministries that he was at, Dad wanted to make sure they knew how to baptize people. And so when they came home from school break, kind of around, Christmas time, he would teach them how to baptize. And I was the one that got practiced on. And Phil, if there's anybody that's saved, it's me, I'm going to tell you right now. And Gary Swick about killed me that day. I about drowned it, and Dad just looked at me and said, "You'll be okay." And that was the end of it. That wasn't even part of my notes. I was just thinking about that. I called Dad Sunday morning because I'd learned that he wasn't doing very well late Saturday. He answered the phone. To my surprise, Denise had just slipped out of the room to get some quick breakfast, I understood. And I was just yelling into the phone. He said, "I just can't hear you." And I yelled and yelled, and it was really loud, but he was really struggling, and he knew it. But he finally, "Yeah, okay, Tom." He said, "I'm done. My body's just done. I'm going to die today." And I said to him, well, Dad, I said, "The Lord will determine that." And he said, "Yeah, I know that's right. But my body is just done. But my mind is really good." I told Dad, "I love you." And I said, "I'll see you later," because he was really struggling. I was really kind of put back, and I thought, I better call the hospital again. This was on the hospital phone, and I called them right back, and I said, "I need to talk to the nurse at the nurse's station." And I explained to the nurse, I said, "This is just not his baseline, and I know he's very hard of hearing, but I said, this was really different." And she said, "Did you just talk to him on the phone?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, you hung up before I got in the room." But he had the phone upside down. So much for the mind part two is what I thought at the time. No more polio. No more falls, even though he tried not to fall. No more poor hearing. No more ER visits. I work in a trauma hospital, Trauma One Hospital, in the ER and trauma area. And people that come into the hospital all the time, you know what we call them? Frequent flyers. most of them are drug addicts. Dad was a fall addict. I bet you Freeman Hospital said, don't put Bob's file away, he'll be back soon, kind of thing, you know. Poor Freeman ER, they're not going to be busy anymore. Just saying. Dad was an early riser. Early riser. And Scripture says this, at 3:45 a.m. Monday, joy comes in the morning. He woke up Monday morning a little bit different on this morning. When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. My sin, oh, the bliss of this glorious song. My sin, not in part, but the whole, is nailed to the cross, and I bear it no more. Praise the Lord, praise the Lord, oh my soul. It is well with my soul, It is well with my soul. And Lord, haste the day when the face shall reside. The clouds re-roll back as a scroll. The trump shall descend, and the Lord shall descend. Even so, it is well with my soul. It is well, yes it is, with my soul. It is well,
A classmate of Dad's at Lincoln Christian College, Lincoln Bible Institute, left there and went on to a distinguished career in preaching and later in teaching at both the college and seminary level. Mark and I both had him as a professor in class when we attended Lincoln. And one day in a preaching class, Dr. Wayne Shaw said, "When you preach biographic sermons, you will be tempted to eulogize the heroes of the faith and forget to spotlight the God they loved and served. As valuable as it may be to study the footprints that were left by Abraham and Moses, David, Elijah, Nehemiah, Esther, Mary, and Paul, the greater good is for God's people to love and obey the God they followed. As all of us know, Dad left many worthy footprints on the path of righteousness.
But as has been mentioned, it is my hope today that we will leave this place more in love and more fully devoted to the God that Dad loved and served. Several New Testament letters have a structural design. Scholars recognize that often the first part of the letter is about what we are called to believe, what God has done to redeem and to secure us. And then the focus shifts. There's a how should we then live portion. In other words, the books open with doctrine and then move to duty. We start with what we profess and then move to practice. We move from the lecture hall to the battlefield. And one of those books is the book of Hebrews. From the very introduction of that book to the middle of chapter 10, the writer lays out the compelling reasons why we must obey, what we must believe, and what God has done to redeem us through Jesus Christ. But then the focus shifts near the middle of chapter 10. When we read these words, "Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stimulate one another to love and good works." Shortly after that, there's a major section which we call chapter 11. It is a hall of fame of the faithful. It's a picture gallery of men and women who lived by faith. Some of them well known. We know their stories. Some of them, not so much. But one of the characteristics that should not escape our notice is that at some point in their life, every single person that is named in Hebrews chapter 11 had the circumstances of life stacked against them. Just look at the list. They had to battle widespread wickedness, poverty, scars, overwhelming defeats, uncertainty, and in some cases, backstabbers from their own ranks. But also tucked away in this photo album are some priceless jewels. For example, if you follow the text, you'll notice that between Enoch, a man who walked with God, and Noah, who built the great big boat, we have this jewel. Without faith, it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. Let me give you the short version of that. God keeps score. Nothing goes unnoticed by him. No matter what sufferings we may shoulder or what blessings we may enjoy, he is always whispering, he is always nudging us toward his rewards for us. And in John 15 it says he even prunes us for our own good, both in this life and the life to come. We heard our dad say many times, live today so that you'll have no regrets in the tomorrows. As has been mentioned in other ways, retreat was not in his vocabulary. Several years ago, I asked Dad what was his favorite Bible verse, if he had one, and I was kind of leaning toward that he would say, well, Romans 12, 1 and 2, where it says, I beseech you, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. And without hesitation, Dad did not choose that verse. He chose 1 Peter 3:15. Oh, he said, my favorite is sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you with gentleness and reverence. You see, Dad knew that whatever it took in our lives to make a worthy defense of the gospel would be rewarded. And because God is a rewarder, Dad interpreted that as God pouring out his lavish grace as an invitation to say, come on up here and get on the front line. Dad wanted all believers, regardless of what they may have been through or where they had come from, to rise above every lesser calling and to give God our best. Because God's rewards always outweigh our sacrifices and our contributions. The second jewel I mentioned is found in verse 13. It says in Hebrews 11:13, all of these died in faith without receiving the promises. But having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For those who say such things make it clear that they're seeking a country of their own. And if indeed they were thinking of the country from which they had gone out, they would have opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. And as a second hammer, he says it again in verse 39. For all of these, having gained approval through their faith, did not receive what was promised, because God had provided something better. Now, on the surface, it has the flavor of a riddle. Why didn't God, give his promises? Why did those who live by faith not receive what God had promised? And the answer is because God's timeline is different than ours. By faith, these men and women understood that in this realm we are strangers and exiles longing for the next realm. A country that John describes as beautiful beyond words, as infinitely secure, a place where there is in a constant state of worship and celebration, where life is lived without fear. No cemeteries, no hospitals, no rehab centers, no pain, no crippling diseases, no passage of time, no loss, no sin, no temptation, no conflicts, no Medicare forms to fill out. Nothing grows old. And God himself deals with our weeping because he's the one who wipes away the tears. Some blessings and promises of God will come in this lifetime, yes. And some will be withheld until the next. Dad was never bitter when he heard testimonies of people who were miraculously healed. He rejoiced with them. We do not know the exact nature of Paul's thorn in the flesh, but the Apostle Paul and Dad decided to be faithful even when God's response to their prayers was, "My grace is sufficient." And so he faithfully endured deafness in one ear and many, many consequences of childhood polio, numerous surgeries, broken bones, and in recent years, severe arthritis in his hands. And yet he soldiered on knowing that he was called to be faithful even in the face of physical restriction. Dad was thrilled to hear the stories of new churches being planted and growing churches becoming healthy, even though quietly he knew that some of the churches he served were not on the verge of revival or community significance. But he loved the church. He was thrilled to tears every year as Ozark Christian College and our sister colleges announced how many graduates were entering vocational ministry and how many young graduates were moving to the mission field or various other evangelistic front lines. I'm the only one of the 5 of us who actually served as an evangelist with the Christian Evangelistic Mission. And Dad was one of the board of directors. He was also the publisher of their monthly newsletter. So every month, it was my duty, it was my responsibility to send a report to Dad about what the attendance averages were for that month and how many calls I had made on prospects and how many were pastoral calls and how many baptisms and transfers we'd had and any items that were worthy of news for those that were supporting the mission. I cannot tell you how many times I would mail that letter, and about 2 or 3 days later, Dad would call and he would say, "I read your report. I guess all those years that I made trips down to the principal's office were just practice runs." There were a lot of those. But because he loved the church, he was desperately vigilant to encourage and cheer it forward. And I think intuitively there were times he knew that I needed a pat on the back. And there were times I think he knew that I needed something stiffer than just a pat, about 15 inches lower. A number of years ago, I had the privilege of visiting Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The National Park Service has done a great job. They've gone to great lengths to preserve and protect the history of Sunday, December 7th, 1941. In addition to the USS Arizona Memorial, the Visitor Center contains photos and memorabilia, but they also have mothballed the USS Missouri, the ship on which the unconditional surrender of Japan was signed. They're sitting side by side. And I toured around that and just kind of enjoying it. Remember when my dad had told the stories when years ago he'd toured there? And then they sounded a large siren of sorts. And all the tourists were invited over to a kind of amphitheater. And what really blessed my life that day was our tour guide. He was old, very weak, stooped over, nearly blind. An aide had to assist him to the podium. And then he spoke. "I was still asleep when the first bombs rocked us out of the barracks. We tried to get the anti-aircraft guns going, but the fires kept us pinned down for nearly an hour. Finally, one of the men got a bulldozer running. We plowed a path down to the ammunition bunker." He leaned on the podium kind of hard, gathered his breath, and he said, "Even though we were surrounded by defeat and there were dead servicemen all around and huge fires, we wanted to make a difference. We knew that if this island fell, it would not be long before the battle would be taken to the U.S. mainland. And we did not want that on our watch." I think Dad understood that sometimes you do a job even if you aren't sure what the outcome is going to be. You do it because it will bless someone. And because it is the loving and gracious thing to do. I think it would be the most honoring thing today you could do is to commit yourself to say, "I'm going to use my resources, my energy, my generosity, my relationships bless those whom God loves, and to live a life that is focused on eternity. I am reminded today, as I've heard these others speak, God may let us lose a few battles in this life so that we will yearn with greater intensity for the next, where He has rewards and promises waiting. As the Apostle Paul was nearing the end of his ministry life, he wrote a deeply personal letter to young Timothy. Scholars surmise that Timothy was struggling. He was burned out. He maybe even walked away from the ministry. He's discouraged, maybe even some physical illness. And Paul wrote to Timothy and said, man, I want you to preach the word in season, out of season, meaning when it's easy and when it's not easy. However, tucked into that passage is also a powerful reflection on Paul's own life. And so after Paul has told Timothy to preach the word carefully and faithfully and passionately, even if it means hardship, he closed with those words that Dad called us to in his opening welcome this today. I am already being poured out as a drink offering. The time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the course, and I have kept the faith. In the future, there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, the rewarder, will award me on that day, and not only to me, but to all who have loved His appearing. Our Father in heaven, as we close this time of memorial, as we say our final farewell, we have begged for you to help us see beyond this moment, to face the future without Dad's verbal encouragement, and to say, I will be faithful. I will live a life fully devoted to you. And to that end, we thank you for Jesus, who sorts out all of our brokenness and seeks what is best for us. In the name of Jesus, our King, we pray.
Trials hard to bear, we're tempted to complain, to murmur and despair, but Christ will soon appear to catch His bride away, all tears forever. Sometimes the sky looks dark with not a ray of light. is one in heaven who knows our deepest care. Let Jesus solve your problem. Just go to him in prayer. Life's day will soon